Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic. Let's do it. What's the closest you've ever come to death, but clearly live to tell? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. In 2003, I was in Iraq serving the military, and someone in the same branch of service got on the radio and called for artillery on my position. Luckily, right before the fired upon my unit, a supervisor caught on to the coordinates, being the same as ours, and cussing got on the radio to put a stop to it. That would have been friendly fire to the max. At least 100 of us would have been gone within minutes. Bilateral pneumonia. I literally was unable to breathe. I was in ICU for 2 weeks and blue lips, completely discolored extremities, and I remember the doctor telling my dad to prepare for the worst. The worst part was they, doctors or nurses, I don't know, I was 9, took these suction cup things and beat the F out of my back to make me cough up the shit in my lungs. It was miserable. Had a horse kick me in the abdomen 2 weeks ago, point blank, no warning. I've been working with horses in a professional capacity for 15 years, and I've been riding for 30 years. The kick dislodged my gallbladder, perforated my duodenum, and tore my liver. Incredibly, I didn't break any ribs, and I remained standing, so no TBI. My girlfriend was with me. In a weird turn of events, usually I'm alone when I'm working at the barn. I'd left my contacts at her house the night before, and she'd driven them out to me. She saw the whole thing, and when the horse kicked me, she asked me what to do, and I told her to go get the owners of the barn, who were only on property because they were prepping for a horse show. I owe her my life. She ran to get the owners, who responded by running after the horses that got loose after I got kicked. Instead of helping them, she ran back to me and called 911. The call dropped a couple of times, but luckily, eventually went through. In the meantime, I had a horse jump my body, an experience I'd hoped I'd left behind with my jumping career, and I'd started trying to move myself into the lounge. So my girlfriend started helping walk me into the lounge, while I told her the address to the barn. I quickly went into shock. I don't remember a whole lot after that, but apparently my barn owner asked, "Does she do this often?" Because I kept insisting I was dying and that I couldn't feel my hands. When I got to the hospital, the staff thought I was drug-seeking and ignored me for about 45 minutes until I called my mom begging her to convince the nurse to give me painkillers so I could sleep. I could barely speak, but the nurse heard enough to angrily take my phone and reprimand me for not calling for her. I had no idea she was there. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours, and I was vomiting and screaming. I couldn't actually breathe well enough to scream, and they were insisting my ultrasound was clear. Luckily, my dad's a surgeon at the hospital where I was admitted, and he lost it on them. 1 CT later, and I was in emergency surgery. 10-day hospital stay, 1 case of pneumonia, 1 abscess near my spine, and I can officially eat solid foods again. Yes, very lucky indeed, and clearly someone as experienced as you, and you just don't know when something like that could happen. Powerful animal. Glad you're alright. I have Crohn's disease, and was on an immune suppressant. This was about 15 years ago when not as many people were using what they call biologics. I had just received an infusion, and then had to travel to San Antonio for work. While we were there, we had dinner outside at the restaurant on the Riverwalk. 10 days after I got home, I got sick with what I thought was the flu. But days went by and I wasn't getting better. My doctor said it was a virus. I just kept getting sicker. My daughter called me every day, and after about 10 days of it, she insisted she was taking me to the hospital. I was there 28 days before I went home. I had contracted histoplasmosis, which is a fungal infection that attacks your organs. I got it after breathing in spores from bat guano blowing in the wind in the San Antonio Riverwalk. It doesn't adversely affect people with normal immune systems. It took the doctors a long time to figure out what I had because I live in the Northwest, and we don't usually see that kind of stuff here. It has an 80% mortality rate without treatment. As soon as they did figure it out and treated me, I got better. I don't remember a lot of those 28 days. Was hiking in the Sierra Nevadas in May a couple years back. Stupid me decided to try to bunker down from a nasty and surprising large oncoming snowstorm near the foot of a large rock ledge. I took a nap and woke up to my A-frame tent somewhat intact but otherwise buried and frozen over from excess snow blowing off the rock ledge I was near, trapping me completely. To make it worse, my tent has a vestibule, but that had collapsed in and completely froze, which is where I happened to leave my ice axe. I was stuck there for about 20 hours, slowly feeling myself losing heat. At the 15-hour mark, I realized I was freezing to death and pulled out my tiny little gas stove to stay warm. I put it near the frozen over exit to my tent and actually managed to slowly thaw it out to the point where I could dig my way out. My tent was under about 4-ish feet of snow that had melted and froze enough times that it became a hardened shell. No idea how I didn't suffocate, since snow is typically airtight. To add insult to injury, it was a beautifully warm 80 degrees Fahrenheit later that afternoon. At me fast. An SUV was going the wrong way on I-805 South. The person must have been suicidal because they were playing chicken with me. If I went right or left, so did this SUV. We barely missed each other by a hair, and the velocity of the SUV shook my car so violently I lost control and started swerving. I managed to regain control and pulled off to the side of the road to check if I got hit. I don't know, it seemed like the rational thing to do, and I honestly just needed to get out of my car. After everything looked fine, I started sobbing and screaming, because in a span of 5 to 10-ish seconds, I would have been dead. Just like that, in the blink of an eye, had that SUV connected head-on, or never regained control of my car. Overdosed an intranasal speedball when drunk. Had a bad time, went to blood jail, woke up on the floor sober. The people I was with just standing there. Crawled to the couch and ended that day. Took acid the next day and had a conversation with a woman without telling her this, and she told me a story about some of her family dying in a car wreck. Reminded me that I'm beautiful and grabbed my hand. I was in a bad way and needed that. I'm sure she could tell. It all felt so desperate. Definitely helped to improve this piss-poor outlook I'd developed. I'm glad there are equally awesome people as there are two shitty ones. I miss her now, but can't remember her face. I hope she's well. The only thing I was thinking when I read this was the woman real or hallucination? Started choking while I was home alone. The phone was too far to get it, but I couldn't speak to call 911 and would have been dead by the time they arrived anyway. Thought, Heimlich on a sturdy chair. Where's a sturdy chair? Oh, the dining room. Stay calm. Get to the dining room. Took a few steps that way, and some weird instinct used that little bit of air already in my lungs. Entire core contracted super hard, like the world's most violent cough. Food flew across the room. It was so weird, because I just spent several seconds mentally calculating how many self-Heimlich attempts I could manage before passing out and dying, and then suddenly was completely fine. Throat hurt a bunch. Abs were sore for a couple days, otherwise no lasting damage whatsoever. But it was down to seconds, and that is such a weird thing to think about. I've been horse riding since 2016. I live in a really hot country, so riding during the summer is hard as the sun is really strong during the day and extremely humid in the evening. This April I scheduled a lesson at around 7 a.m. thinking that the heat wouldn't be as intense as summer wasn't in full swing. But I couldn't have been more wrong. I didn't bring water with me to that lesson as I live pretty close to the stables and I'm able to walk there whenever I have a lesson. It was my dad's birthday, and we decided to walk to the stables together at 7 a.m. in the morning, underestimating how hot it would be. I got on the horse, and 15 minutes into the lesson, I started to feel extremely hot, and that day I was riding a difficult horse. I was putting all of my effort in that lesson to stay on as I started to feel lightheaded at certain times. There were a few times that my eyes went foggy during the lesson, and I was holding on for my life. Once the lesson was over, I asked my dad to get me some water from the small cafe. I downed the bottle within 2 minutes, and we started to walk back home. I began to start walking slower, and I didn't feel right. I called out to my dad, who led me to under a tree, and called my mom, asking her to bring us home. I was trying my best to keep standing straight before my dad looked at me and started shaking me. My skin was turning yellowish green, and my lips were turning a little purple. My back protection was soaking wet. It has never gotten that wet. I ended up fainting in the heat and was taken to the hospital. I was put under IV as I was severely dehydrated and had to take a break from riding for a few weeks to rehydrate. The doctor informed my parents that if I had walked back in the heat, I would have most likely ended up in a worse condition than I was and possibly died. I'm now on electrolytes and always bring a bottle of water with me to lessons. Pretty much clinically died from a lithium overdose. When I was around 8 years old or so, I was prescribed lithium. I had no reason to ever be on this medication. I was given an adult-level dosage, and after a few days I started having really bad reactions to it. I ended up having a stroke, a massive seizure, and ended up in the hospital for a few days. At the worst point of this overdose, my heart stopped. My brain was also pretty much melting from the massive fever, and I basically was clinically dead for a few seconds. I still remember the experience vividly, full out-of-body experience, feeling like I was thrown into a pool of water and waves of peace, only to be thrown back into my flesh prison and back into the chaos of what was happening. This was around 25 years ago. I believe I ended up having a TBI from this, and to this day my memory is still effed, and now I have a seizure disorder, NES. Yeah, F giving kids lithium when they aren't bipolar or do not need it. F the doctors who nearly killed me from malpractice. Look, I'm clearly not a medical professional in any way, shape, or form, but it just seems to my uneducated mind that prescribing lithium to an 8-year-old is extreme, I think, right? Is it? At the Kelpies in Scotland, Falkirk, where I'm from, when I was around 5, a man approached me and asked for me to come in his van to get a free puppy. My parents had taught me well on how to deal with the so-called stranger danger, and as my parents told me to do, I screamed at the top of my lungs, bad man," and ran away. Later on the news that night, we find out the same man had been caught and sentenced to life after he kidnapped a child and murdered them. I guess my parents aren't so bad after all. In college, I jumped into a river at night, in November, after I'd been drinking all day. Swam 20-ish yards, then turned around. Because of the cold water and alcohol, I was losing feeling in my legs, and about halfway back I couldn't move them anymore and went under. Fortunately, I had made it close enough to the shore for the bottom of the river to start sloping back up, so I was able to grab onto some plants and tree roots to pull myself forward until I could stand. I was only underwater for a few seconds, but I have a vivid memory of the adrenaline kicking in and my drunk brain having a very clear and sober, I'm about to drown thought. It was pretty wild.